Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon.
It began in a moment that did not belong to clocks. Some would call it a second, others a fraction, but to him it felt like a room between heartbeats, a place he could step into without meaning to. The world would hum softly, still as glass, and within that hush, a boy named Rick felt both smaller and larger than he could explain. He was no more than a child then, hair tangled from wind, shoes scuffed by gravel roads, but his eyes carried something restless, as though he had always been looking past the horizon. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was sorrow, or perhaps it was the strange inheritance of someone who listened too closely to the secrets of silence. At night, when the world should have been sleeping, he would sit by the old fence outside his house. The boards leaned tiredly, the way old men lean on canes, and the grass grew uneven around them. Rick would press his palms into the cool earth, tilt his chin to the sky, and wait. The stars, he believed, were not just lights. They were whispers, quiet songs for those patient enough to hear. He couldn't prove it. He couldn't explain it. But when the field stilled and the insects softened their buzzing, there it was, a faint murmur threading through the dark, a sound that belonged not to his ears but to his chest. It was gentle and aching, as though the heavens remembered something they longed to tell. No one else seemed to notice. His mother would call him inside, voice weary from long days, and his father's shadow rarely lingered long enough to see him sitting there. Friends from school teased him, saying he had his head too high in the clouds. But Rick didn't mind. He wasn't searching for proof, only for the feeling that the world was larger, stranger, kinder than people dared to admit. He discovered the between by accident. One afternoon, the sun hung low, spilling a honey-colored light through the trees. Rick had been chasing a cricket, laughing at how quick and clever it darted, when suddenly everything stopped. The cricket froze mid-leap, its shadow cut sharp against the dirt. Leaves halted in mid-tremble. Even the air seemed too thick to breathe. Rick blinked. For a moment he thought he'd gone blind, but no, he could see. He could move. Only the world had paused. His small hand hovered near the cricket, and he felt a strange tugging, not in his body but somewhere deep within, as if a string inside him had been plucked. He pulled back, and just as quietly as it had begun, the moment released. The leaves resumed their trembling. The cricket vanished into grass. Rick stood very still, heart racing, wondering if he had dreamed it. But no, dreams fade. This had pressed into him too deeply to vanish. He didn't tell anyone. Some things are too fragile to speak aloud. Instead, he began to test it. At first, it happened only when he wasn't trying, when he was lost in thought, when sadness lingered, when awe swelled in him so strong he could barely hold it. But over time, he learned that if he slowed his breathing, if he held a kind of quiet inside himself, he could find that space again. He didn't call it magic. He didn't even think it was a gift. To him, it was simply listening more carefully than others dared. This was the beginning of his strangeness, though Rick never thought of it that way. He only knew that the world around him moved too quickly, and he had found a way to slow it down. It wasn't power. It wasn't control. It was refuge, a place where he could rest when everything else felt too sharp. Yet, as all children do, he carried loneliness. His mother was kind, but often tired, her face shadowed with worries he couldn't name. His father drifted in and out, never anchoring himself long enough for Rick to feel steady beside him. And so, the boy learned to keep company with silence, to treat quiet as both friend and teacher. In that hush, he began to understand things other children did not. That kindness often hides in small gestures. That sorrow teaches us to look closer. That the world hums with a music most people forget to hear. One evening, as dusk pressed itself gently against the earth, Rick returned to the fence where he so often sat. The sky was streaked with fading pink, the first stars shyly appearing. He leaned his cheek against the wood and whispered, "If you're out there, say something." He did not expect an answer, but as his eyes fluttered closed, a breeze lifted through the grass and carried with it a sound, not words, but a melody faint as memory. It reminded him of a lullaby he thought his mother once sang when he was very small, though he could not be certain. The tune curled around him, wrapping his small frame in warmth. For the first time, Rick felt sure the stars were alive, and they had not forgotten him. That night, he dreamed differently. In his sleep, time stretched wide and gentle. He walked among moments like stepping stones, each one glowing softly beneath his feet. He did not know where the path led, but he felt no fear. Only a quiet wonder, and when he woke, the world seemed lighter, as though the dream had left a trace of itself behind. From that day on, Rick carried a secret inside him, A secret that shaped the way he saw everything. He didn't chase the loud games of other children. He didn't crave attention or applause. Instead, he watched. He listened. He stretched quietly into moments others rushed through, learning their textures, their colors, their scents. He noticed when someone smiled without meaning to. He noticed when someone's eyes clouded with unspoken grief. He noticed the smallness and the vastness of things, both at once. It was not always easy. His classmates called him strange, sometimes cruelly. His teachers sighed when his thoughts wandered. But Rick held his secret gently, the way one holds a fragile bird. He knew it was not meant for everyone to understand. What he didn't yet know, what no one could have told him, was that this listening, this drifting through time's quiet folds, would one day shape everything he became. It would guide his friendships, test his heart, and carry him into a story far larger than the fence, the field, and the lonely house where his childhood began. And so the boy waited, listening to stars, holding moments in his hands as if they were fireflies. A restless soul in a world that moved too quickly. He learned patience in the spaces between heartbeats. He did not yet understand what it meant to be different, nor the weight that difference might one day bring. But in that stillness, in that soft hum of time's secret music, Rick began the first quiet steps of a journey that would stretch beyond memory itself. And as the boy grew, the nights continued to hold him gently, as though they knew he belonged more to the stars than to the noise of the world. The fence where he once pressed his cheek became a familiar companion, weathered by rain and softened by years, yet it always seemed to wait for him. Rick returned to it often, carrying the unspoken bond he felt with silence. His eyes, sharper now with age, followed the constellations, as though they were maps to something just out of reach. The strange pauses in time still found him, though he had stopped trying to command them. They slipped into his life like breath, sudden, natural, uninvited, yet necessary. Sometimes he would feel the hush of stillness in the middle of class, his pencil hanging above the paper while the clock hands froze. Other times it was during a storm when lightning froze in the sky like a painting, its brilliance held long enough for him to memorize every branching crack. These moments frightened him at first, but fear softened into awe, and awe softened into something gentler still, a quiet belonging. He began to think that perhaps time itself was not a ruler of his life, but a companion bending just slightly to allow him rest. He could not share this truth with his classmates. They would only laugh, or worse, treat him like he was broken. So he carried it inside, the way children sometimes carry invisible treasures, hidden in plain sight. It was during one of these frozen moments that he first felt the stars speak more clearly. He had been lying in the grass after a long day, arms tucked behind his head, watching the early night scatter its jewels across the sky. A hush fell, the crickets stilled, the air turned soft and weightless. Rick's breath slowed, and then he heard it. A note, a hum, faint as if it were sung from the other side of a dream. It was not a word, not anything he could translate, but the sound touched something deep in him, a place words had never reached. It was the same tune he thought he remembered from his mother, the same ghost of a lullaby. Only now he realized it belonged not just to her, not just to memory, but to the fabric of the world itself. He tried to hum it back, his voice cracked. Too young, too uneven, but he carried the melody as best he could. When the stillness released and time moved forward once again, the breeze that brushed his face seemed warmer, almost approving. He smiled into the dark, and for the first time in a long while he did not feel alone. Seasons folded one after another. Rick grew taller, his shoulders carrying more of the weight of adolescence. He was clever in ways teachers didn't quite know how to handle, too restless for simple lessons. Too curious for rules, too quiet when he should have been loud. He learned to hide his wandering thoughts behind half smiles and shrugs, but inside he was always listening, always waiting for the next hum in the silence. Books became his allies, especially those that hinted at mysteries the world could not explain. He read about stars, about clocks, about the invisible forces that shaped life, but none of it truly matched what he felt when the world paused around him. The words on the page were flat compared to the living hum that thrummed inside his chest. And yet, even with his secret, he longed for connection. There is only so much silence a child can hold before it becomes heavy. One afternoon, while sitting under the same fence, he found a companion, not in the stars, not in time itself, but in another child who wandered too far from his own yard. Morty was smaller than him, wide-eyed and uncertain, carrying an innocence that clung to him like sunlight. He stumbled through the tall grass, looking lost, until his eyes found Rick. The two boys stared at each other for a long moment, neither speaking. Then Morty asked the simplest question, "What you doing?" Rick wanted to deflect, to dismiss. But instead he surprised himself. "Listening," he said. Morty tilted his head. "To what?" The stars, Rick answered quietly, waiting for the laughter, the teasing. But Morty didn't laugh. He sat down beside him, awkwardly crossing his legs, and looked up. Do they say anything? Rick almost smiled. Sometimes. That was enough. It was not understanding, not fully. But it was trust, the kind of trust that children give freely before the world teaches them to doubt. From then on, Morty began to return. Always curious, always patient. Even when he didn't quite know what he was waiting for, together they lay in the grass, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, sometimes simply staring at the expanse above. Rick never shared the truth of how time bent for him, but he let Morty hum along when he tried to mimic the lullaby of the stars. Their friendship was not built on explanations, it was built on presence. The world around them often felt too sharp, too fast, too demanding, but in that little corner of Earth by the weathered fence and beneath the forgiving sky, they found a rhythm all their own. Rick began to notice something new then. When Morty was beside him, the moments of stillness stretched longer. The pauses in time seemed gentler, easier to enter. It was as though friendship itself was a key, unlocking doors he could not open alone. Rick never told Morty how much that meant. He didn't know how to put it into words, and perhaps words would have broken it. Instead, he let their silences speak, the way stars spoke to him, without explanation, only presence, only music. And in this way, the boy who once carried loneliness like a second shadow began to grow differently. He was still restless, still strange, but now he carried with him the warmth of another voice beside his own. Time bent still, the stars hummed still, and the world remained its mysterious self. But now he was not entirely alone in the listening. And though he did not yet realize that this companionship, fragile, imperfect, luminous, would become the thread that held him steady through every storm that lay ahead. It would become the reason he continued to listen even when silence turned heavy, even when time itself seemed to lock him inside its endless cages. For now, though, it was enough that two boys could lie beneath the stars, humming lullabies neither fully understood, and feel as though the universe itself leaned closer to hear. The nights with Morty became a rhythm, a quiet thread weaving through Rick's restless days. What began as chance meetings in the grass soon grew into something expected, almost sacred, as though the stars themselves had conspired to place Morty at Rick's side. Their conversations rarely went deep, but their silences did. Sometimes Morty would speak of small, ordinary things, how his shoes always wore out too quickly, or how his grandfather's stories never seemed to end, but Rick found comfort in those details. They grounded him, tethering his drifting thoughts to something human. And in return, Rick gave Morty the gift of listening, of never dismissing even his strangest wonderings. It was during one such evening, lying side by side with their hands folded behind their heads, that Rick felt the pause again. He had grown accustomed to its arrival, to the sudden stillness that pressed down like the hush before a storm. But this time was different. This time Morty was there. The crickets stilled, the air thickened, and the stars above seemed to sharpen into impossible clarity. Rick turned his head, expecting Morty to be frozen like the rest of the world, caught mid-breath, mid-blink. But Morty blinked back at him, slowly, confused, awake. Rick's chest tightened. He had never shared this place before. Do you feel that? He whispered. Morty frowned, looking around at the unmoving trees. The silent night. It's quiet, too quiet. His voice was shaky, but it was real. Rick's lips parted, words failing him. For years he had believed this secret was his alone, some strange trick of his own bones and blood. Yet here was Morty trembling beside him, not locked out but drawn in. The realization filled him with both awe and fear. Together they stood, moving carefully through the stillness. The world felt heavy and fragile, as though one careless touch might shatter it. Rick reached out toward a falling leaf, its edges caught in mid-descent. His fingers brushed against it, and it quivered, but did not fall. Morty gasped, clutching Rick's sleeve as though he might vanish if he let go. Don't be scared, Rick murmured, though his own voice shook. It's just a doorway. He had never used that word before, but it felt right. This wasn't just a pause or a trick. It was an entrance to somewhere deeper, a space between the spaces, where time itself stretched wide enough to hold them. A doorway into what? He didn't know. But standing there with Morty, he felt less like an intruder, and more like a guest, as though the world had been waiting for him to arrive with a companion. They walked slowly, testing each step, marveling at the way their voices barely echoed in the thickened air. Morty kept asking questions: what was happening, why it was happening, whether they'd ever get back, and Rick had no answers. All he could say was it doesn't last forever. And true enough, after only a few breaths, the heaviness released, the leaf fell, the crickets sang, and time resumed its march. Morty stood wide-eyed, his face pale in the starlight. Rick, he whispered. What was that? Rick didn't know how to explain, not without breaking the fragile mystery of it. So he only said, something we're not supposed to understand. Not yet. From that night on, the doorway appeared more often. Sometimes Rick stumbled into it alone, but more and more Morty was drawn in too, as though the bond between them had widened the opening. They learned to recognize the signs, the slowing hum of the air, the faint ache in their chests, the way shadows lengthened unnaturally. When it came, they stopped whatever they were doing and simply let it happen. They didn't fight it. They didn't force it. They drifted. The doorway wasn't always the same. At times it was a hush that lasted only long enough for Rick to trace the veins of a leaf. Other times, it stretched into long silences, minutes perhaps, where they wandered side by side through a world caught mid-motion. Once, they found themselves standing in a field of fireflies, their lights frozen in mid-glow, little stars suspended just above the grass. Morty laughed, the sound breaking strangely against the thick air, and reached out to cup one of the tiny lanterns in his palm. It glowed against his skin, soft as memory. Rick felt something stir in him then, something larger than awe. It was responsibility. If this doorway had opened for them, it was not by accident. The world was entrusting them with something fragile, and he knew, even without words, that he had to carry it carefully. But as wonder deepened, so too did unease. Not every doorway felt gentle. Some were heavy, pressing against their lungs, making their steps sluggish. Once, Morty's voice stuttered, as though the stillness had wrapped too tightly around his throat. Rick gripped his hand, pulling him through, whispering reassurances. He didn't fully believe himself. They made it out, time rushing back in a flood of noise and breath. But afterward, Morty's eyes held questions Rick couldn't answer. Why us? Morty asked one evening, his voice small. Rick shook his head. I don't know. Maybe because we listen. It was the only truth he had. They didn't choose this. They didn't earn it. They simply listened more carefully than others dared, and in listening, they were invited in. Slowly, Rick began to experiment, not recklessly, but with the careful curiosity of someone who knew the fragility of what he held. He tried moving faster, slower, whispering into the stillness to see if it whispered back. He discovered that if he focused too hard, the doorway collapsed, as though it resented control. But if he softened, if he let go of wanting and simply breathed, the doorway lingered longer. It was a paradox. The more he released, the more it opened. Morty followed his lead, though less gracefully. He stumbled often, afraid to trust the silence, but Rick's steady presence kept him anchored, and together, step by tentative step, they learned that the doorway was not a place at all, but a way of being, a surrender to something greater than themselves. Neither spoke of what it meant for their future. Neither dared. It was enough for now to walk through these strange thresholds hand in hand, to stand among frozen stars and falling leaves, to feel the hush of eternity brushing against their skin. It was enough to know that the world was stranger, softer and more beautiful than anyone else around them realized. And deep within him, Rick felt the first true stirring of destiny, not the grand, thunderous kind sung about in legends, but a quiet thread weaving itself through his life, pulling him towards something vast and unexplainable. A thread he could neither cut nor ignore. The doorways became a quiet secret between them, stitched into their days like threads too delicate to show anyone else. They spoke little of it, even to each other, but the silence that followed each passage carried more meaning than words could hold. When time slowed and the world stood still, Morty would look to Rick with wide, uncertain eyes, and Rick would nod steady and calm, though inside he often felt the same trembling wonder. They had become companions not only in life but in stillness, learning to share a language no one else could speak. It was during these stretches of shared quiet that Rick noticed something else beginning to change. Not in the air, not in the stars, but in himself. He had always carried restlessness, a constant ache that urged him to peer beyond the edges of the familiar, but now that ache began to take form. He started to think less about the mystery of the doorways and more about what he might do with them. The pauses were no longer accidents. They felt like invitations, and though Rick was still young, he was already aware of the weight that invitations carried. Some were meant to be accepted, some were meant to be refused. The hard part was knowing which was which. One afternoon, when the sun pressed long shadows across the ground, Morty suggested they wander farther than the fence in the field. They followed the road into the outskirts of town, where buildings leaned together like old friends. An alleyway stretched cool and narrow between them. Morty walked with hesitation, but Rick strode with the quiet confidence of someone chasing something unseen. The world seemed louder here, busier, filled with the chatter of voices and the smell of bread drifting from windows. It was here, among the bustle, that they first noticed the Jellybean King. He was not called that by anyone they knew. It was a name Rick gave him later, half in jest, half in reverence. At first glance, he was just a strange man sitting outside a shop, a crown too big for his head tilted to one side. His robes were patched with bright colors, and his pockets jingled faintly with candies he offered to passing children. But there was something about him that felt different, not quite in step with the world around him. His smile was kind but tired, his eyes bright yet shadowed, as though he too carried secrets too fragile to speak. Morty tugged at Rick's sleeve. "He looks funny," he whispered. Rick studied the man. Funny, yes, but not in the way Morty meant. There was a sorrow in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored something Rick knew too well. Without thinking, Rick stepped closer. The Jellybean King noticed and gave a small bow of his head. "Evening, boys," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a lullaby, half forgotten. "Out chasing the sky, are you?" The words startled Rick. He had expected nonsense, perhaps a joke, but not that. How could this man know? He glanced at Morty, who only shrugged, and then replied, "Sometimes." The Jellybean King chuckled gently. "Good. The sky needs chasing, otherwise it forgets to dream." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 small candies, placing them in their palms as though offering treasure. "Here, sweetness for the road." It was a simple act, but something in Rick stirred. He felt the faint hum again, the pull of the doorway lingering just beneath the surface of things, and for a heartbeat he wondered if this man too could feel it. They thanked him quietly and moved on, but Rick's thoughts lingered. Over the following weeks, they saw the Jellybean King again and again, always sitting in the same spot, always smiling gently at the world as though he were a visitor rather than a part of it. Sometimes he told them small stories, nonsense about clouds that argued or rivers that remembered names. But within the nonsense lay a strange wisdom. He spoke of loneliness with the same tenderness one might use for flowers, and Rick felt both comforted and unsettled. Morty was wary. He didn't dislike the man, but he often kept his distance, whispering to Rick that something about him felt off. Rick, however, couldn't help but feel drawn. The Jellybean King seemed to see him in a way no one else did, not as a boy who was strange, but as someone standing on the edge of a larger truth. One twilight when Morty had gone home early, Rick lingered by the shop alone. The Jellybean King patted the step beside him. "You carry silence with you," he said without preamble. Rick stiffened. "What do you mean?" The man smiled, his crown slipping further down his brow. "Some children shout to be heard, some hide to be safe. But you walk with silence, as though it were a friend. I see it in your eyes." Rick swallowed hard. He had never told anyone about the stillness, the pauses, the doorways. He wanted to deny it, but something in the man's gaze held him steady. "And if I do," he asked cautiously, "then you must treat it kindly." The Jellybean King replied, "Silence is not an emptiness, it is a promise. Break it, and you lose yourself. Keep it, and it will keep you." The words clung to him long after he left, heavy and mysterious. For the first time, Rick wondered if his secret was not his alone. Perhaps others had walked through the doorways before him. Perhaps others had lost themselves there. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. When Rick told Morty about the conversation, Morty frowned. "I don't know, Rick, he's weird. Maybe too weird." Rick only nodded. "So am I." And though Morty shook his head, he didn't argue further. He understood in his own way. Strange recognized strange. And for Rick, the Jellybean King became more than a curiosity. He became a mirror, flawed, unsettling, but reflecting something Rick needed to see. The friendship between the boys continued, steady as ever, their nights beneath the stars undisturbed. But now, woven into their silence, was the echo of another presence. A man with sorrow in his eyes and riddles on his tongue, who seemed to know too much about silence and promises. Rick didn't yet know whether the Jellybean King was a guide or a warning. He only knew that meeting him had shifted something inside, as though a new doorway had cracked open. Not in time, but in trust, in mystery, in the strange bond between those who carry loneliness like a crown. And so the boy who once listened only to stars now found himself listening to voices on the ground as well, uncertain, curious, drawn deeper into the fragile web of connection that stretched before him. The days that followed carried a subtle shift, as though an invisible current had begun moving beneath the surface of Rick's quiet routines. His meetings with the Jellybean King were no longer chance encounters. They had become a pattern woven into the rhythm of his afternoons when the sun began to tilt toward evening. Morty often accompanied him at first, but his unease grew sharper with each visit. He complained of the man's odd way of speaking, the way his laughter sometimes carried a note that wasn't entirely warm. Rick, though, couldn't pull away. Something in the Jellybean King's gaze seemed to recognize the unspoken questions Rick held inside, and for a boy who had always felt adrift, that recognition was magnetic. One afternoon, Rick went alone. Morty had made an excuse about chores, though Rick suspected he simply didn't want to come. The street was quieter than usual, the shops shuttering earlier than expected, leaving the Jellybean King more distinct in the fading light. He sat as always, crown lopsided, robe frayed at the sleeves, a small bag of sweets in his lap. When Rick approached, the man's smile widened, and without speaking, he held out a jellybean the color of deep midnight. Rick hesitated before taking it. "What's special about this one?" he asked, rolling the candy between his fingers. The man's eyes gleamed strangely in the twilight. "That one tastes like memory," he said softly. "Bitter and sweet, tangled together. Not everyone is ready for it." Rick frowned, uncertain if it was just another riddle, but he slipped the candy into his pocket instead of his mouth. For reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't want to taste it. Not yet. The Jellybean King leaned closer. "You've seen the doorways, haven't you?" Rick froze. His heart thudded so hard he thought it might crack the silence between them. "What doorways?" he asked cautiously, though his voice lacked conviction. The man chuckled low and knowing. The pauses, the slips between heartbeats, the places where time forgets itself. His tone was casual, but his eyes searched Rick's face with unsettling precision. "I thought so. I can see it in you. The way you listen for silence. The way you carry it like an old friend." Rick swallowed hard. He had never told anyone, not even Morty, the full truth. He wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but the weight of the man's gaze held him still. "And if I have," he whispered. The Jellybean King leaned back, sighing as though burdened by something heavy. "Then you must be careful. Doorways are gifts, but gifts have teeth. Step too far, and they will bite." The warning lodged deep in Rick's mind. He wanted to ask more, to demand what the man knew, but before he could, footsteps echoed down the street. Morty appeared, slightly out of breath, muttering about his chores being finished faster than expected. His eyes flicked between Rick and the Jellybean King, narrowing with suspicion. "We should go," Morty said firmly, tugging at Rick's sleeve. The man only chuckled again, waving them off as though dismissing children at play. But as they turned to leave, Rick glanced back and saw the Jellybean King watching him with an intensity that bordered on sorrow. It made Rick shiver, though he didn't understand why. That night, beneath their usual stars, Morty confronted him. "I don't like him, Rick. He knows too much. He's wrong somehow." Rick lay silent for a while, the grass cool beneath his back. Finally, he admitted, "He knows about the doorways." Morty sat up sharply. "What? How? Did you tell him?" "No," Rick said quickly, shaking his head. "He just knew. Like he could see it in me." Morty's face twisted with worry. "That's not good. Maybe we shouldn't see him anymore." Rick didn't answer. He wanted to agree, but the pull inside him was stronger than Morty's caution. Someone finally understood. Someone had named the thing that had haunted him for years. He couldn't let that go. Not yet. In the following weeks, Rick's visits grew more frequent, sometimes with Morty trailing reluctantly behind, sometimes alone. Each time, the Jellybean King shared fragments of riddles that seemed designed only for Rick's ears. He spoke of silence as a map, of stillness as a bridge, of choices that led not forward or backward but sideways into places unseen. One evening, when the sky glowed red with sunset, the Jellybean King asked Rick a question that lingered long after it was spoken. "If the doorway offered you freedom, would you step through, even if it meant leaving everything you loved behind?" Rick faltered. "I don't know." "You will," the man said softly, with a sadness that felt older than his years. "The day will come when the question won't be if you step through, but if you can resist." That night, Rick didn't speak to Morty beneath the stars. He lay awake, staring at the sky, the man's words echoing like a bell in his chest. Freedom, leaving, the ideas tangled together, frightening and tempting all at once. But it wasn't only temptation that grew in Rick. Doubt crept in too. The more riddles the Jellybean King offered, the more Rick sensed something hidden behind them, a shadow beneath the sweetness. Sometimes, in the man's laughter, Rick caught an edge too sharp to be harmless. Sometimes, in the way he spoke, there was hunger, as though he longed for something he could not reach. Rick began to wonder if the Jellybean King's wisdom was a gift or a trap. Yet even as the questions multiplied, so too did the pull to return, to listen, to learn. Morty noticed the change. One evening, frustration burst out of him. "He's not your friend, Rick. He's just using you somehow. I can feel it. Please, just stop going to him." Rick's jaw tightened. And what if he's right? What if he knows things I need to know? You don't understand, Morty. He sees me. He sees what I'm carrying. No one else does, not even you. The words stung and Morty recoiled, falling silent. Rick regretted them the instant they left his mouth, but he didn't take them back. He couldn't. The truth of them sat too heavy inside him. From that moment, a quiet tension threaded between the boys, unspoken but present. They still shared their stars, their silences, their laughter. But the Jellybean King had become a third presence in their friendship, invisible yet undeniable, pulling Rick in one direction and Morty in another. And in the midst of it all, the doorways grew sharper, more frequent, as though time itself were aware of the choice forming in Rick's heart. He could no longer escape the feeling that the silence was watching, waiting, ready to open wider than it ever had before. Rick carried Morty's silence with him like an unhealed bruise. The night after their quarrel, the stars seemed more distant, less like companions and more like faint reminders of everything he could not reach. The Jellybean King's words had seeped into him like ink, staining his thoughts in ways Morty's laughter could no longer wash clean. He told himself he wasn't choosing sides, but deep down he knew he had already leaned toward the shadowed pull of riddles and promises. The following days passed in a peculiar rhythm. Time itself seemed to falter around Rick, pausing in strange ways that only he noticed. Leaves on trees held their breath mid-rustle. Raindrops hovered a moment too long before falling, and once Morty's voice stretched like an echo trapped between seconds. Each time it happened, Rick felt the same trembling in his chest, as though a door had cracked open just wide enough for him to peek through. He began testing it in secret. Alone in the woods, he would stand still and wait, listening for the silence that wasn't silence at all, but a pulse hidden beneath the air. Sometimes it came quickly, sometimes not at all. But when it did, he would feel the world bend slightly, as though asking him to step forward. He never did, not yet. He lingered at the threshold, afraid of what might lie beyond, and yet unable to stop searching. The Jellybean King noticed. When Rick returned to him, the man's eyes narrowed with a glint of pride or hunger. It was hard to tell. You felt it more, haven't you? The space is calling to you. Rick tried to hide his unease, but the man chuckled knowingly. Don't be afraid of it. Fear is just another kind of leash. You were never meant to be tied down. Rick shifted uncomfortably. And what if stepping through means leaving the people who matter? The Jellybean King's smile thinned. People come and go, boy. They love, they leave, they forget. But the silence waits for you. Always. Something in that answer unsettled Rick, but he couldn't let go of the words either. They echoed inside him long after he walked away, mingling with his own doubts and Morty's warnings, until he no longer knew what belonged to him and what belonged to the king. Morty, meanwhile, watched his friend slipping further from him with growing dread. He tried to pull Rick back with small kindnesses, sharing his favorite bread, telling jokes beneath the stars, pretending not to notice when Rick's mind wandered elsewhere. But the distance stretched, fragile and invisible, like a crack in glass that deepened each day. One night, after Rick had been gone longer than usual, Morty whispered into the darkness, "I don't want to lose you." The grass and stars gave no answer. Rick returned later, eyes bright with something Morty couldn't name. He spoke in half-thoughts, about pauses and doorways, about questions too vast for a boy his age to carry. Morty listened, trying to understand, but the more he listened, the more he felt his friend slipping away into places he couldn't follow. The turning point came on a rain-soaked afternoon. Rick had gone to meet the Jellybean King again, this time carrying the midnight-colored candy he had kept hidden for so long. The man smiled when he saw it, as though he had been waiting. "Have you decided?" the king asked. Rick held the jelly bean tightly in his palm. "What happens if I eat it?" The king's gaze softened, but his voice carried a gravity that pressed against Rick's heart. "Then you will remember what was always hidden from you. And once you remember, you cannot forget." Rick's breath caught. The rain pattered around them, steady and slow, as though urging him to choose. He almost raised it to his lips, but Morty's face flashed in his mind, his laughter, his stubborn warnings, his quiet loyalty. Rick lowered his hand, trembling. "I can't," he whispered. The Jellybean King's expression hardened, but only for an instant before he masked it with another smile. "Not yet, then, but the day will come." That night, Rick didn't tell Morty about the candy. He only lay beside him under the stars, silent, while Morty tried to fill the air with stories of their childhood games. Yet beneath Morty's words, Rick felt the echo of the Jellybean King's certainty pressing against him. The day will come. Over the following weeks, the doorways grew more insistent. Rick no longer had to seek them. They found him Time stuttered at the most unexpected moments. A bird halting mid-flight, a candle's flame frozen in place, Morty's hand hovering above his without touching. Each pause grew longer, sharper, until Rick began to feel less like an observer and more like the one being observed. One evening, as the boys walked home through the quiet streets, Rick stopped suddenly. The world had gone silent in that familiar, uncanny way. The lantern light no longer flickered. The breeze no longer stirred. Only Morty's face moved, flickering like a candle at the edge of the pause. Rick felt the door yawning wide, wider than ever before, inviting him in. Morty grabbed his arm, shaking him. "Rick, don't!" His voice trembled with fear, though he could not see what Rick saw. Rick's heart pounded. He wanted to step forward to see what lay beyond, but Morty's grip anchored him. He tore his eyes from the stillness and met Morty's pleading gaze. For a long, fragile moment, two choices stretched before him: freedom or friendship. Silence or the boy who had never left his side. He chose to stay. The doorway closed and time resumed its flow. The lantern flickered again. The wind brushed past. The bird continued its flight. But Rick knew something had changed. The silence had shown him its full hand, and though he had resisted this time, he doubted he could forever. That night, as he lay awake beneath the stars, he whispered to himself words he could not share with Morty. "I don't know how long I can hold on." And somewhere in the distance, the Jellybean King smiled, as though he had heard. The silence did not leave Rick alone after that night. It lingered at the edges of his days, pressing softly like a tide that knew no retreat. He tried to ignore it, tried to bury himself in the comfort of Morty's steady presence, in the small rituals they had built together, sharing bread at dusk, lying side by side beneath the stars, trading quiet words in the spaces no one else could hear. But the pull was constant. The doorway had shown itself fully now, and Rick carried its weight inside him like an unanswered question. Morty, though, saw the strain in his friend's eyes. He noticed how Rick would drift into stillness mid-sentence, gaze far away as though he were listening to something beyond the world they shared. He noticed the hesitation in Rick's laughter, the way it broke off too soon, swallowed by thoughts Morty could not reach. And though Morty said little at first, his heart filled with fear, a fear he tried to mask with loyalty but could not hide entirely. One evening, as they sat together under the vast sweep of the night sky, Morty finally spoke. "Rick," he said softly, "what do you see when it happens?" Rick hesitated. He wanted to lie to protect Morty from the truth, but he couldn't. "I see pauses, like the world is holding its breath, and behind it, something else. Something I can almost touch." Morty's face tightened. "And if you touched it?" Rick's voice faltered. "I don't know, maybe I'd disappear, maybe I'd become something else." Morty turned away, staring at the stars as if they might hold answers. "I don't want you to disappear," he whispered. The words lodged deep in Rick's chest. He felt both guilty and helpless, caught between the warmth of Morty's care and the cold inevitability of the silence pressing at his soul. He reached for Morty's hand, their fingers brushing, and though neither spoke further, the touch carried more weight than words could bear. Yet the Jellybean King was never far. He lingered at the edges of Rick's days like a shadow that stretched no matter where the sun stood. When Rick approached him again, the king greeted him with a look that was almost triumphant. "You've resisted," the man said, voice smooth as honey and sharp as glass. "But you feel it growing stronger, don't you? The silence doesn't give gifts without demanding them back." Rick frowned. "Why me? Why do I see these things? Why not anyone else?" The king's smile was tinged with sorrow. "Because you were born carrying it. Some are marked before they ever take their first breath. You, Rick, were never meant for only one world." The words both comforted and terrified him. He wanted to demand more answers. But before he could, the Jellybean King leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Sooner or later, the choice won't be yours. The doorway will open wide, and either you step through, or it swallows you whole." Rick's throat tightened. "And if I don't want to leave Morty behind?" For a moment, the king's expression softened, almost human. "Then you must teach him how to let go. Because love, boy, is not a chain. It is a lantern, and lanterns burn out." Rick left unsettled, his mind crowded with riddles he didn't want but couldn't ignore. That night, he tried to hide his unease, laughing with Morty as though the Jellybean King's words hadn't sunk into him. But later, when Morty had drifted to sleep beside him, Rick lay awake, staring at the stars, repeating the phrase in his head, "Love is not a chain, it is a lantern." The days grew heavier. The pauses came more often, and each time, Rick felt less like he was resisting and more like he was being studied, measured, awaited. Sometimes he thought he saw shapes in the stillness, shadows flickering at the edge of vision, as though something alive moved inside the silence. He never told Morty. Some truths felt too heavy to share. But Morty sensed the change. He grew quieter, his usual warmth shaded by worry. One afternoon, after Rick had been distant too long, Morty grabbed his shoulder, forcing him to meet his gaze. Rick, listen to me. You're still here, with me, right? You're not gonna just leave without saying anything. Rick's lips parted, but no sound came. He wanted to promise to give Morty the comfort he deserved, but the words tangled in his throat. At last, all he managed was a strained, "I don't want to leave." Morty's eyes shone with unshed tears. Wanting and doing aren't the same thing. The silence between them was raw and aching, filled with everything they could not say. That night, the doorway opened wider than it ever had before. Rick was alone, sitting beneath the moonlight, when the world stuttered and froze. The air grew heavy, thick, alive with expectation. This time he saw it clearly, a path of shimmering stillness, stretching out before him like a river of glass. It beckoned, it whispered, it promised. Rick stood trembling, one step away from surrender, when Morty's voice broke through. Rick? He had woken and followed, eyes wide, heart pounding. Don't go. The sound of his friend's voice pierced the stillness like a blade. The path quivered, rippling like disturbed water, but it did not vanish. Rick stood caught between two worlds, the endless unknown and the fragile, steadfast boy calling him back. Tears stung his eyes, though he couldn't say why. His chest ached with the weight of it, with the unbearable truth that he could not belong fully to both. He turned, meeting Morty's gaze, and for that moment, he chose to remain. The path dimmed, folding back into silence. Time resumed. But as Rick collapsed to the ground, chest heaving, he knew the truth the Jellybean King had whispered was real. The choice would not wait forever, and when the silence came again, it would not be so kind as to let him turn away. Morty rushed to his side, gripping his shoulders, his voice breaking. I've got you, you're still here, please. Stay with me. Rick closed his eyes, leaning into that warmth, though the chill of the silence lingered inside him, patient, certain, unstoppable. Rick could still feel the shimmer of the vanished path in his bones, like a faint ringing that refused to fade. Though he had stayed, though he had chosen Morty in that fragile moment, the silence had not left him. It had seeped deeper, as though marking him for what was yet to come. Each breath felt heavier now, each heartbeat slightly out of tune, and he knew the stillness was no longer content with waiting. Morty stayed close in the days that followed, watchful and anxious, as if fearing that Rick might vanish in the space of a blink. He offered jokes, distractions, simple kindnesses that had once anchored Rick, but the weight of the silence dulled them. Rick wanted to respond, to reassure him, but the more he tried, the more hollow his words sounded. He carried guilt for it, guilt for every time Morty's eyes sought comfort he could not give. One night, beneath the stars that had so often been their sanctuary, Rick broke the silence first. Morty, if something happens, you'll remember me, right? Morty frowned, his throat tightening. Don't talk like that. You're not going anywhere. Rick's lips curved into a faint smile, but it was filled with sorrow. The silence doesn't ask permission. It doesn't care what I want. Morty grabbed his hand, gripping it tightly. Then I'll hold you here, no matter what it takes. Rick let the words wash over him, a fragile light in a gathering storm, though deep down he feared even Morty's love might not be enough to bind him. The Jellybean King's presence grew stronger during this time, as if sensing the silence as hunger. Rick found him waiting more often, perched in alleys or seated upon crumbling stone steps, his crown tilting in the dusk light. Each encounter felt sharper, the riddles less like games and more like truths with teeth. You linger too long at thresholds, the king murmured one afternoon when Rick sat across from him with trembling hands. The doorways grow restless when ignored. Rick's jaw clenched. Then tell me what's behind them. Why me? Why now? The king's eyes glinted, and for once he answered without riddles. Because you are not meant to remain whole in one place. You are meant to stretch across silences, to carry pieces of yourself into the places others cannot go. But every gift demands its price. Do you think the silence will let you walk free without claiming its due? The words struck deep. Rick wanted to deny them, but the memory of the shimmering path still haunted him. He remembered the way his body had trembled, how close he had come to stepping forward, how much he had wanted to. And what if I resist? Rick whispered. The king's smile was slow, cruel in its sadness. Then it will take you anyway, piece by piece, until the boy beside you no longer recognizes the friend he loves. Rick flinched at the thought. He rose abruptly, walking away, Morty's name on his lips like a shield. But the king's laughter followed him, soft and knowing, threading through the air long after Rick had left. That night, Morty noticed the shadows in Rick's expression. What did he say to you? He pressed, desperate. Rick hesitated, torn between protecting Morty and sharing the weight of what had been spoken. At last he murmured, "He said the silence won't let me go, not without taking something first." Morty's eyes widened with fear, but instead of retreating, he pulled Rick close, their foreheads touching. "Then it can take it from me too. I'm not leaving you alone in this." The devotion in Morty's voice was fierce, and for a moment Rick felt a flicker of warmth that fought against the cold creeping in his chest. He didn't tell Morty that the silence did not bargain, that it would not settle for sharing. Some truths were too cruel to speak aloud. In the days that followed, the world itself seemed to lean closer to Rick, as though the silence had begun warping the edges of reality around him. Shadows stretched too long at dusk, sounds echoed when they should not, and sometimes Morty's voice arrived a fraction too late, as though time itself were stumbling to keep up. Rick grew weaker with each pause, his skin pale, his eyes dim, but he tried to mask it, tried to pretend nothing had changed. Morty wasn't fooled. One morning he confronted him outright. "You're fading, Rick. I can see it. Don't lie to me." Rick's throat tightened. "I'm trying to fight it." "Then let me fight it with you," Morty pleaded. But Rick only shook his head. "This isn't a fight. It's a tide. You don't stop a tide by pushing against it." Morty's eyes burned with helpless anger. "Then I'll hold on to you even if it drags us both under." The silence grew bolder after that, appearing not just in moments of solitude but in the midst of their togetherness. Once as the boys walked through the crowded marketplace, time fractured around Rick, freezing faces mid-expression, stalls mid-motion. Only Morty seemed untouched, gripping Rick's arm as if sensing the shift. The world shimmered with that impossible path again, but this time whispers filled the stillness, soft, endless, coaxing him forward. Rick's knees buckled and Morty caught him. "Stay with me! Don't listen to it!" Morty's voice trembled, desperate, but it cut through the whispers like a fragile flame. Rick clung to that flame, forcing himself to remain, though each choice left him more exhausted, more brittle. Later, in the quiet of the night, Rick confessed what he feared most. "Every time I say no, it feels like it takes something from me anyway. I don't know how much of me will be left when it's done." Morty's eyes filled with tears, but his voice was steady. "Then I'll remember the pieces. Even if you can't. Even if you fade. I'll keep them safe." Rick turned toward him, eyes glistening. "Why do you care so much? Why won't you let go?" Morty's reply was simple, unshakable. "Because you're my friend, and friends don't let each other fall into the dark alone." For the first time in weeks, Rick felt something inside him soften, not a victory, but a fragile resistance born of love. He didn't know if it would be enough, but as Morty's hand clasped his tightly beneath the stars, he allowed himself to believe, if only for a moment, that perhaps the silence could be delayed. But somewhere, unseen, the Jellybean King's smile widened, for he knew delays were not escapes, and the silence had endless patience. The silence lingered long after the Jellybean King's words had faded, stretching itself into every corner of Rick's mind. He tried to drown it out with distractions, tinkering with broken gadgets, brewing strange mixtures, even forcing himself into conversations he didn't care about. But the stillness seeped back in, patient and unyielding, as though it had already marked him and was simply waiting for the moment he would collapse into its grasp. Morty noticed the cracks widening. He noticed the way Rick's hands shook even when holding a glass of water, how his words faltered mid-sentence as if swallowed by an invisible hand. At first, Morty tried to joke it away, tried to pretend they could live as they had before, but the truth pressed heavier each day. One evening, when the stars hung pale and distant, Morty broke the silence between them. "You're slipping more," he whispered, afraid that saying it aloud might make it worse. "It's not just little moments anymore. You're not all here." Rick didn't look at him. He stared at the horizon, his eyes dim and glassy. "I told you, every time I fight it, it takes something anyway. Maybe it's just waiting for me to run out of things to give." Morty's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to demand Rick stop talking like that, but the fear in Rick's voice silenced him. Instead, Morty reached out, gripping Rick's arm tightly. "Then I'll give it something instead. I'll take the hit." Rick's head snapped toward him, anger flashing in his expression. "No, don't even think about it. You have no idea what this thing wants." "Then let me find out," Morty shot back. His voice shook, but the resolve in it was undeniable. "You're fading in front of me, and I can't just stand here and watch. If it wants something, maybe I can make it take me instead." Rick's chest tightened, torn between fury and fear. He wanted to tell Morty he was wrong, that sacrifice wouldn't work, but the boy's determination made his words falter. All Rick could manage was a broken whisper. "You're not bargaining with it. It doesn't bargain." The following nights brought no peace. The silence grew stronger, creeping into their shared moments until even Morty felt it. He described it as a chill at first, a thin emptiness curling around his chest. But soon it was more moments where he felt Rick's hand in his own and yet saw it flicker, as though Rick's presence were half shadow already. The Jellybean King appeared again, always waiting at the edges, his crown crooked and his smile too sharp. This time Morty confronted him directly. "If you know what it wants, then tell me how to stop it from taking Rick." The king tilted his head, studying Morty with a strange amusement. "You would walk into silence for him. You would risk becoming its echo." "If it keeps him here, yes," Morty said fiercely, surprising even himself with the strength in his voice. The king's laughter was soft, like glass breaking in slow motion. "Then perhaps it will listen. But do not confuse listening with mercy. The silence does not love as you do. It collects, it consumes, it leaves only traces." Morty's fists clenched. "Then I'll be its trace. I don't care. As long as Rick's still here." The king leaned closer, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Remember those words when the silence asks its price. You may find it takes more than you imagined." Later, Morty didn't tell Rick about this exchange. He couldn't. Rick was already carrying too much. Instead, Morty stayed closer than ever, watching him, steadying him when the world fractured around him again. Each time it happened, Morty would anchor Rick with his touch, his voice, his presence, pulling him back from the shimmer of the path. But one night the silence came not with whispers, but with a voice that filled the air around them, thick and suffocating. Both Rick and Morty froze as the sound rippled across the stars. "Give," it intoned deep and endless. "Or be taken." Rick staggered, clutching his chest, his breath ragged. Morty threw himself in front of him instinctively. "Take me," he shouted. His voice cracked, but it carried through the void. "Leave him alone. Take me instead." The silence swelled, pressing against them like a tide, and Rick reached for Morty's hand. "No, don't do this, Morty. You don't understand what you're offering." But Morty held firm, his small frame shaking. "I'd rather lose myself than lose you. If it wants a price, then let it be mine." The air grew heavier, the world bending. For a moment, Rick thought Morty might vanish before his eyes, but then everything stilled. The silence retreated just enough to leave them gasping in its wake. It had not taken Morty, not yet, but its patience was thinner now, its hunger sharper. Afterward, Rick sat with Morty beneath the fading night sky. His voice was hoarse, fragile in a way Morty had never heard before. "Don't ever do that again. Don't offer yourself. If it takes you, there's no point in me staying." Morty looked at him, eyes glistening. "But if it takes you, there's no point in me staying either." The honesty in his words cut Rick deeper than the silence ever could. He pulled Morty into an embrace, holding him as though the strength of his arms alone could shield them both. He didn't know how much time they had, didn't know how many more nights he could resist, but he knew one truth with absolute clarity. Morty would not let him face this alone, no matter how terrible the cost. Far off, unseen but ever present, the Jellybean King watched and smiled. For in Morty's devotion lay the silence's sharpest weapon, and he knew the moment was approaching when choice itself would fracture. The night after Morty's offering lingered heavy, as though the silence itself had left a handprint on the air. Rick didn't sleep, he hadn't truly slept in a long time. But that night was different. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the hush pressing against his thoughts, waiting, listening. Morty had curled against him stubbornly, refusing to let go, as though holding Rick could anchor him to the world. And maybe in a fragile way, it did. But Rick knew what Morty couldn't. Silence doesn't retreat when denied. It circles, patient, calculating. It waits for weakness. By morning, the edges of reality were already shifting again. The colors of the dawn bled strange and wrong. Shadows bent in directions they shouldn't. And the air itself seemed to breathe. Rick steadied himself with a trembling hand on the wall, muttering calculations he no longer trusted. Morty was at his side instantly, his face pale but resolute. "You're worse today," Morty said softly. "It's not letting up." Rick swallowed hard, his throat dry. "It's escalating. It heard you last night, Morty. You gave it something it wanted, hope? That's dangerous. It'll use that against us." Morty frowned, jaw tight. "Then maybe I should give it more. Maybe if I just—" "Stop!" Rick's voice cracked harsher than he intended. He forced Morty to meet his eyes. "It doesn't deal in fair trades. Every offer you make just tells it how much you're willing to lose. Don't hand it the map to your heart." The words silenced Morty, but they didn't erase the determination burning in his gaze. He couldn't stand by while Rick unraveled. Not when the silence seemed to peel pieces of him away day by day. Later that evening, when the house had grown unnervingly still, the silence returned. This time it didn't whisper. It spoke with the fullness of a void, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Choose, it said. The word was simple, but the weight of it bent the room, making the walls tremble. Rick felt his knees weaken. He clutched the counter, his knuckles white. Choose what? His voice was low, though he already knew the answer. The silence deepened like an ocean pulling at the shore. One remains, one departs. Morty's breath caught, his hand instinctively reaching for Rick's. It wants us to decide, he whispered, terrified. Rick shook his head violently. No, that's not a choice. It's a trap. You pick one, it takes both. You pick neither, it waits. Either way, it wins. Morty's grip tightened. Then we don't choose, we hold on. The silence lingered, oppressive and endless, before receding slightly, like a predator circling rather than striking. But its message was clear, time was running short, and indecision was not immunity. In the uneasy quiet that followed, Rick found himself trembling. He hated how powerless he felt. Hated that his universe, could shrink to something as small as this. A boy's hand clutching his own, and a voice demanding sacrifice. For the first time in longer than he could admit, Rick wanted to cry. Morty noticed. He always noticed. He leaned closer, his voice soft, unsteady, but certain. You've carried me through so much, Rick. Maybe it's my turn to carry you. Rick closed his eyes, pain stabbing sharper than any wound. Morty, if you go, there's nothing left of me to carry. Don't you get it? You're the only thing keeping me here. Morty's breath shuddered out. He didn't argue, didn't speak again. He simply rested his head against Rick's arm, grounding them both in the simplest truth. Neither of them was willing to let go. The following days blurred into one long vigil. The silence pressed closer, its intervals shorter, its demands sharper. It wasn't always words now. Sometimes it was visions, illusions meant to fracture them. Morty would see Rick vanish mid-step, only to return moments later with no memory of leaving. Rick would hear Morty's voice calling from another room, only to find Morty sitting silently beside him. It was breaking the seams of their reality, testing the strength of their bond. And yet, in that pressure, something unexpected grew. Morty found himself braver, steadier, as though each demand from the silence carved away the boyish fear he once carried. He looked at Rick, not just as a guide anymore, but as someone he could protect, even in small ways. Rick, in turn, began to soften, not in his sharpness or wit, but in the way he allowed Morty to steady him, the way he let his walls slip. One night, Morty spoke with a quiet certainty that startled Rick. If it ever comes to it, if it ever forces the choice, I want you to know what mine will be. Rick turned sharply, panic flaring. Don't say it. Don't you dare. Morty didn't waver. I'd pick you. Every time. Rick's chest clenched painfully. He wanted to rage, to scream at Morty for saying such a thing, but the words caught in his throat. Because deep down, Rick knew the unbearable truth. If the silence forced him, he would make the same choice. He would pick Morty even if it meant his own end. The silence, always listening, seemed to stir at this unspoken symmetry. The air vibrated faintly, a ripple of satisfaction, as though it had learned exactly what it needed, that love itself could be a weapon, if turned the right way. And far away in the blurred edges of their reality, the Jellybean King stood watching, crown tilted, smile cruel and knowing. The silence was no longer just pressing in. It was preparing to claim its true price. The night bled into morning without distinction, as if time itself had grown weary of moving forward. Rick and Morty sat in silence, not by choice, but because every word now felt like an invitation for the void to press closer. The silence had learned their rhythms. It knew when they were weakest, when exhaustion carved open the spaces inside their hearts. And that was when it spoke again, not as a whisper, but as a tide rolling across the fragile walls of their world. Now, it said, the single syllable carrying the weight of inevitability, the choice. Rick clenched his jaw, refusing to answer. His hands trembled violently, but he pressed them into fists until his knuckles whitened. Morty, sitting close enough to feel the tension in Rick's body, lifted his gaze toward the ceiling as though searching for stars that had long since been swallowed. We don't choose, Morty said, steady despite the fear inside him. We've told you we don't. But the silence only thickened, the air trembling as though a storm brewed in the very marrow of the world. It began to fracture their surroundings, the walls bending inward, shadows splitting into jagged lines. Objects flickered in and out of existence, as if reality itself had been reduced to a failing memory. Rick staggered, his body heavy, his breath uneven. He tried to stabilize himself with muttered equations, half-formed theories scratched onto any surface he could find, but the numbers dissolved before he could finish them. It's collapsing the frame, he rasped. This isn't just pressure anymore. It's unraveling everything around us. Morty reached for him, his grip grounding, his voice sharp. Then we hold together. That's what it wants us to forget. That's what it's testing. Rick looked into Morty's eyes and saw no hesitation, no trace of the boy who used to flinch at every shadow. He saw something stronger, something forged in fear but tempered into steel. And it terrified him because he knew what that kind of resolve would mean when the silence struck its final blow. The Jellybean King appeared then, half-formed in the fractured air, his crooked crown gleaming faintly. He did not speak, but his grin said enough. He was watching, waiting, reveling in the unraveling of their bond. The silence spoke again, its voice like a door closing forever. One must remain. One must depart. The path requires balance. Choose. Pete's chest heaved, fury breaking through his fear. Balance? You talk about balance like it's some kind of equation, but all you do is consume. You're not balance, you're decay. The silence did not argue. It only pressed harder, forcing the space around them into a trembling collapse. Morty gasped as the floor beneath them shifted, tilting as though gravity itself had lost interest in order. Rick pulled him close, both of them stumbling, and hissed into his ear. Don't say anything. Don't answer it. If we resist long enough, maybe it'll... But Morty cut him off, his voice low and deliberate. Rick, it's not gonna stop. You know it. I know it. The more we refuse, the more it takes from you. Look at yourself. You're breaking. Rick's heart wrenched. Morty wasn't wrong. His body was weaker every day, his mind clouded, whole hours slipping from his memory. The silence was already feasting on him, piece by piece. And Morty was still whole, still burning bright, even here. No, Rick whispered, shaking his head. If it takes me, it takes me. That's the deal. You survive. You keep going. You don't trade yourself for me. Morty's eyes filled, but his voice did not waver. But if it takes you, I'm gone anyway. You don't get it, Rick. You're not the only one who decides what's worth living for. The silence swelled, as if savoring the truth between them. It began to manifest images, visions pulled from their memories, twisted into weapons. Morty saw Rick vanishing into the shimmer of the path, his figure stretching into nothing. Rick saw Morty crumbling to ash in his arms, his voice silenced forever. The images came one after another, relentless, until both of them were on their knees, gasping for breath. Choose, the silence demanded again, louder, harsher. Rick's vision blurred. He wanted to scream, to rage, but all he could do was hold on to Morty's trembling hand. We don't choose, he said, voice breaking. You hear me? We don't. Morty's grip tightened, his small fingers steadying Rick even as the world buckled around them. For a moment, the silence paused, almost curious. It had expected despair, surrender, but instead it found defiance, fragile yet unbroken. The Jellybean King tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes, stubborn to the end. But everything breaks, eventually, even devotion. Rick looked at Morty then, and Morty looked back, their gazes locked in a quiet promise. They would not choose. They would endure. But deep down, Rick knew the silence wasn't finished. It had shifted tactics before. It would again. And when it did, it would strike not at his body, nor at Morty's courage, but at the fragile tether of love itself, the bond that kept them alive in the dark. That night, as they lay side by side in the hollow of a fractured world, Rick whispered what he had never dared say aloud. If it comes down to it, if it takes me, don't let go. Keep remembering me. That's how I'll stay. Morty turned toward him, eyes wet, voice barely above a breath. If it takes you, Rick, I'll follow. You're not leaving me behind, not in this world, not in any... The silence heard, and it smiled. The silence no longer lingered outside them. It had begun to seep inward, curling like smoke into the marrow of their thoughts. Rick could feel it in the pauses between his words, in the way his breath caught for no reason, in the flickers of Morty's face when it blurred for half a second too long, as though memory and presence were no longer the same thing. Morty felt it too, though he tried to hide it, tried to act as though his courage was enough to keep the void at bay. But the silence was clever. It was no longer demanding only with words. It was reshaping the spaces between them, making every glance and every touch uncertain. That evening, as the sky bent itself into wrong colors, Morty stirred beside Rick with a troubled look. It's in me too now, isn't it? He asked softly. I feel it when I close my eyes, like it's waiting behind the dark. Rick froze. He wanted to deny it, wanted to reassure Morty with a lie, but the boy's voice had been too certain. Rick swallowed hard, his throat tight. Yeah, it's creeping. Not just me anymore. Morty shifted closer, resting his head against Rick's arm. Then we don't have much time. Rick stared ahead at the fractured horizon, his chest tightening with guilt. He had spent his life running from attachments, convincing himself love was just another weakness to be exploited. And yet here, in this quiet unraveling, Morty had become his anchor, the one thing keeping him from giving in. And that meant the silence had found its sharpest weapon. Not his fear, not his regret, but the bond between them. The Jellybean King appeared again that night, clearer than ever, his form almost solid now, as though the silence had given him substance. His crooked smile gleamed in the half-light. "You've resisted longer than most," he mused, his voice slick with amusement. "But resistance is not survival. The silence has patience. You don't." Morty glared at him, fists clenched, though he knew they would do no good. "If you think we're gonna hand each other over, you don't know us at all." The king chuckled, tilting his crown. "Hand each other over? No, that's not what the silence wants. It wants what lies between you. The tether, the devotion, the weakness you mistake for strength." Rick's stomach dropped. He understood. It wasn't asking them to choose anymore. It was preparing to consume the bond itself, to strip away the love that held them together, leaving them hollow and alone. The silence swelled, confirming his fear. This time its voice was not directed at them individually, but at both at once. Give what binds, break the tether, and remain. Rick's breath faltered. He felt Morty's hand slip into his, gripping tight, refusing to let go. He shook his head, voice cracking with defiance. "No, you can take me. You can take everything. But you don't touch this. You don't touch us." The void pressed harder, and suddenly memories began to fracture. Morty gasped as moments of his childhood, their adventures, their laughter, even their arguments, flickered and dissolved before his eyes. Rick saw it too, whole years vanishing in an instant, as if they'd never been. The silence wasn't just threatening anymore. It was already feeding. Morty's voice broke into a sob, but his grip did not loosen. "Rick, it's taking us apart." Rick pulled him close, holding his head against his chest as though he could shield the boy from the unraveling. "Then fight, Morty. Hold on to me. Even if everything else goes, hold on to me." And they did. Through the pressure, through the dissolving moments, they clung to each other with a ferocity born not of fear, but of love. For every memory erased, they spoke new ones aloud, defiant in their creation. Rick whispered about the first time Morty had laughed so hard he couldn't breathe. Morty reminded Rick of the time he had fallen asleep in the garage with a sandwich still in his hand. Tiny, fragile moments, spoken into the void, anchors against the dark. The silence shuddered, displeased, and the Jellybean King sneered. "You think words will save you? You think love is stronger than the void? Foolish." But something in the air shifted. For the first time, the silence did not sound infinite. It recoiled slightly, as though the act of remembering, of holding on, had made it stumble. Rick noticed. His heart leapt with desperate hope. "It doesn't like this, Morty. Keep talking. Don't let it have us." So they did, through tears, through trembling. They kept speaking, weaving their bond into a thread the silence could not easily sever. The void pressed harder, bending reality into a nearly unbearable weight, but Rick and Morty clung to each other, speaking love, speaking memory, speaking truth. When at last the silence withdrew, it left them drained, shaking, but still together. The Jellybean King's grin faltered for the first time, his form flickering at the edges. He tilted his head, his voice low and dangerous. "You've delayed the inevitable, but the silence is patient. It always wins." Rick tightened his arm around Morty, his eyes blazing with quiet defiance. "Not tonight. Not us." Morty's breath shuddered out, but he managed a trembling smile. "We're still here, Rick. We're still us." And as they drifted into uneasy rest, their bodies pressed close, they knew the battle was far from over. But they also knew the silence had felt something it hadn't expected. Resistance not of strength, but of love, and that made it wary. For the first time, the void understood it might not consume without cost. Yet, as they slept, faint whispers rose in the distance, colder, sharper. Preparing, the silence had not been defeated. It was only changing its shape, waiting for its next strike. The night that followed, their resistance felt heavier than the ones before, as if the silence itself had grown more watchful, more calculating. Rick awoke first, his body trembling with the exhaustion of what they had endured. And for a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe they had bought time. But then he noticed the shift. Morty was still beside him, his chest rising and falling, yet something about the rhythm was off. Too steady, too precise. Rick leaned closer, his breath catching, when Morty's eyes opened without hesitation, pupils fixed and unblinking, a hollow sheen replacing the boy's usual warmth. "Rick," Morty's voice whispered, though it carried none of his soul. "Do you love me?" Rick froze. It was Morty's face, Morty's tone, but the cadence was wrong. The words fell into the air like traps, carefully placed. He clenched his jaw, rage and fear, warring in his chest. "You bastard," he muttered under his breath, recognizing the silence game. "You think you can turn him into your puppet? You think I won't know the difference?" The thing wearing Morty's shape tilted its head, smiling faintly. "He is yours. Every memory, every moment, every thread. And yet, threads can be cut." Rick's heart thundered as Morty stirred again, this time for real, groaning and clutching his chest. "Rick, what's happening?" His voice was raw, frightened, but alive. Rick helped him up quickly, glaring past him at the shadow that had receded but not vanished. "It's changing tactics, Morty," Rick said tightly, his voice low. "It figured out brute force won't break us. Now it's gonna try to twist us, make us doubt what's real." Morty's face went pale and he swallowed hard. "So, how do we fight that? I mean, if we can't trust what we see or hear." Rick gripped Morty's shoulders firmly, forcing him to meet his eyes. "Then you trust this? Me and you. No matter what shape it wears, no matter what voice it steals, you remember the difference. You'll know me, Morty, and I'll know you." The silence pulsed at the edge of their perception, displeased. For a long stretch, nothing happened, and the waiting was almost worse than the attacks. They moved carefully through the distorted landscape, each step feeling heavier, until they came upon a river, or what looked like one. Its surface shimmered like liquid glass, and in it reflections moved independently of their bodies. Morty froze at the sight. The reflections weren't just mimicking their present selves, they were replaying moments of their past, but bent, altered. Rick saw himself pushing Morty away in anger, leaving him behind, walking into the void alone. Morty's reflection showed him choosing safety, running from Rick, abandoning him in his darkest hour. Both twisted visions carried the sting of possibility, the thread of choices that could have been. "Don't look at it," Rick barked, grabbing Morty's arm. But Morty's gaze lingered, his breath quickening. "What if it's true, Rick? What if someday I can't take it anymore? What if I leave you behind?" His voice shook, caught between fear and shame. Rick's gut twisted. He hated the thought more than anything, but he forced himself to speak steady. "Then I'll still find you. I'll still drag you back, Morty, because no version of you that matters ever leaves me." Morty's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, tearing his gaze from the river. The silence pressed against him, furious at being denied its snare. The reflection shattered into black shards, vanishing into the void. But it wasn't finished. That night, when they tried to rest, Rick awoke again to whispers, not from the silence itself, but from Morty's lips as he slept. Words in the boy's voice, but carrying venom that was not his. "You're poison, Rick. You ruin everything you touch. You'll ruin me too. Better if I let go now." Rick's chest clenched like a vice. He shook Morty awake, gripping him by the shoulders. "That's not you, that's it talking through you." Morty's eyes snapped open, wide with panic. I heard it too, Rick. In my dreams. It made me say things I didn't want to. Like it was pulling the words out of me." Rick pulled him close, voice breaking. "Listen to me, Morty. Whatever it makes us see, whatever it makes us say, it doesn't matter. What matters is what we choose when we're awake. And I choose you, every damn time." Morty buried his face against Rick's chest, shaking, but his grip tightened with determination. "Then I choose you too. No matter what it shows me, no matter what it makes me say." The silence recoiled again, but not without leaving its mark. Rick could feel its anger deepening, sharpening into something colder. It had failed to sever them with force, failed to sever them with illusions. Now it would try something more insidious, turning their love itself into the weapon. That realization haunted Rick as he lay awake, Morty finally asleep in his arms. He could feel the void watching, patient and cruel, waiting for the moment when even their bond could be twisted into a blade. For the first time, he wondered if love could survive being weaponized against itself. And as the darkness thickened around them, the Jellybean King's voice drifted through the air once more. Quieter, crueler. Every tether phrase in the end, Rick. Even yours. Especially yours. Rick shut his eyes, holding Morty closer, forcing himself to believe the opposite. Yet deep down, the fear lodged itself inside him like a splinter. And the silence, patient as ever, felt it take root. Rick barely slept, his mind gnawed raw by the echo of the Jellybean King's words. Each syllable clung like poison, feeding a fear he refused to name. Morty rested against him, warm and steady, And yet Rick could not shake the suspicion that even this comfort was fragile, a thread waiting to snap. He replayed every moment of their journey in his head, every promise spoken, every crack the silence had tried to pry apart. It was too deliberate, too patient. This enemy was circling closer. When morning came, or what passed for morning in that fractured world, Morty stirred awake with a faint groan. His eyes, though tired, still carried that glimmer of trust Rick had clung to through the night. But as Morty sat up, Rick noticed something new, a faint mark along his arm, black and jagged, like veins drawn by shadow. Rick's chest tightened. Morty, what the hell is that? Morty blinked down at it, startled. I don't know, it wasn't there before. His voice wavered, fear crawling beneath it. It doesn't hurt, not really, just feels cold. Rick grabbed his wrist, examining the creeping blackness. His mind worked furiously, but no equation, no theory, no formula could explain it. This wasn't science. It was corruption. The silence wasn't only trying to break their minds anymore. It was sinking its claws into Morty's body, seeding itself inside him. The void around them pulsed, almost smug. Rick glared into the darkness, his teeth grinding. You think you can take him from me piece by piece? You picked the wrong kid. You picked the wrong man. Morty tried to pull back, but Rick wouldn't let go, his voice softened, trembling against the fury inside him. Morty, listen to me. This thing is gonna try harder now. It'll hurt you. It'll use you against me. But I swear, I'm not letting go. I'm not losing you. Morty nodded weakly, but his eyes betrayed the terror clawing at him. What if it's already too late, Rick? What if it's inside me now? What if I turn into something you can't save? Rick's throat burned, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Then, with a force that surprised even himself, he pulled Morty into his chest, clutching him tight. Then I'll save you anyway, or I'll burn this whole damn void down trying. For a time, they walked in silence, the black mark slowly spreading along Morty's arm. He tried to hide it under his sleeve, but both knew pretending wouldn't make it go away. The air grew colder, the landscape shifting into cruel shapes. Structures rose and fell in the distance, towers that resembled cages, bridges that led nowhere. The void was showing them its true shape, an endless labyrinth of despair. At one point, Morty stumbled, gripping his head. His voice dropped into a tone Rick didn't recognize. You don't love me, Rick. Not really. You love what I do for you. You love that I follow you. But if I stopped, you'd throw me away. Rick froze, horror washing over him. The words were Morty's voice, but not Morty's truth. He knelt quickly, gripping Morty's face. No, that's not you talking. That's it. His eyes burned, fierce and unyielding. You're not disposable, Morty. You never were. You're the one thing I can't replace. For a moment, Morty's gaze flickered, torn between himself and the intrusion. Rick held steady, refusing to break eye contact, and at last the boy shuddered and sagged into him, whispering, I don't want to be lost, Rick. You won't be, Rick whispered back, though the words tasted like a prayer more than a promise. The silence seethed around them, its patience thinning. If fear and illusion couldn't break them, if corruption couldn't turn Morty fully, then it would drive them into the heart of despair. The path shifted underfoot, dragging them toward a vast open expanse, and in its center stood a figure. Rick's breath caught in his throat. It was Morty, or rather, a version of him. This reflection was older, colder, eyes filled with resentment. He looked at Rick with a sneer that cut deeper than any weapon. He's lying to you, Morty, the doppelganger said, his voice steady and venomous. He'll keep you until you're broken. Then he'll find another. That's all you are to him. A placeholder. Morty trembled, torn between the figure and Rick. The black veins on his arm pulsed in rhythm with the reflection's words, as though feeding on the doubt. Rick stepped forward, his voice shaking but resolute. I've made mistakes, Morty. I've been selfish, reckless, cruel, but I never replaced you. I never wanted anyone else beside me. You're not a placeholder. You're my partner. You're my family. The reflection laughed, cold and hollow. Family? You destroy family. You already destroyed yours. Morty will be no different. Morty whimpered, clutching his head, the corruption spreading faster now. Rick could see the choice pressing down on him. The silence was using Morty's own fear against him, turning him into a battlefield. Desperation clawed at Rick's chest. He fell to his knees in front of Morty, grabbing his hands, ignoring the chill of the spreading blackness. His voice cracked with every word. Morty, you have to hear me. Not it. Not the reflection. Me. I love you. Not because you follow me. Not because you make the adventures bearable. I love you because you're you, and I will never, ever let this thing take that away. Morty's breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes darting between Rick and his twisted double. Then with a sudden cry, he ripped free of the reflection's gaze and collapsed into Rick's arms. The black veins pulsed violently, then slowed, retreating slightly as though the silence itself had recoiled. The reflection screamed, its voice breaking into static, before shattering into shards of shadow that dissolved into the void. Rick held Morty tightly, his own body trembling from the strain. The black mark was still there, but subdued, beaten back for now. Morty's tears soaked his coat. His voice small and exhausted. "Rick, I don't want to fight anymore. I just want to be with you." Rick pressed his lips to Morty's forehead, his own tears falling freely. "Then that's what we'll do, Morty. We'll fight as long as we have to, but we'll be together. That's how we win." The silence retreated for the moment, but Rick knew this wasn't over. It attested them, corrupted them, tried to drive them apart. Next time, it would strike harder. Next time, it would aim for the heart of everything they had left. But for now, Rick held Morty close, refusing to let go, clinging to the fragile but unbreakable bond that had carried them this far. The silence lingered after the shadow of Morty's reflection had shattered, but Rick knew it wasn't retreat in defeat. It was the pause of something older calculating its final move. He held Morty close, his hands pressed firmly to the boy's back, as though his own heartbeat could drown out the cold rhythm pulsing beneath Morty's skin. The veins of darkness still coiled faintly along Morty's arm, reminders that the void had not let go. Rick could feel the weight of inevitability pressing on them both. The silence was not done, and this time it would not simply whisper doubts or conjure shadows. This time, it would demand everything. They walked for hours, though time itself felt slippery, bending in odd directions. Sometimes it seemed as if the path stretched forever. Other times the ground folded beneath their feet like pages turning. Rick's mind kept racing. He tried to calculate, to plan, to engineer a solution in his head, but every idea dissolved under the sheer alien strangeness of what they were facing. This wasn't an equation he could solve or a lock he could pick. It was something more primal, something that demanded not logic but sacrifice. Morty's voice broke through his thoughts, small and worn. "Rick, what if we can't win?" Rick stopped, turning to look at him. The boy's face was pale, his eyes sunken from exhaustion, but still clinging to that fragile spark of hope. Rick felt a pang that cut deeper than any wound. He wanted to tell him they would make it, that there was a way out, but the truth burned bitter on his tongue. He forced his voice steady, rough but sincere. "Then we don't win, Morty. We survive. One step at a time. And if we can't, then I'll make damn sure you don't have to face the end alone." Morty's lip trembled, but he nodded, leaning into Rick's side. That small weight was enough to remind Rick why he couldn't falter now. He might not be able to conquer the silence, but he could fight for Morty until the very last moment. The void shifted ahead of them, forming a vast chamber, unlike anything they had seen. It stretched infinitely, walls rippling like liquid shadow, and in its center stood a figure, neither monstrous nor human, but something in between. It had no face, only the outline of a head, no form but a shifting silhouette that mirrored whoever looked at it. When Morty gazed upon it, he saw himself older, weary, broken. When Rick stared, he saw a man bent with failure, holding nothing but regret. The figure's voice filled the chamber, not spoken but breathed into their bones. "You cannot carry him any further. He is mine. To keep him, you must give yourself." Rick stiffened, pulling Morty behind him. Not happening. The figure tilted, its featureless face shimmering like glass. Then he will dissolve, piece by piece. He will fade into the silence. You will watch him go, unable to save him. Choose. Morty gasped, clutching his arm as the black veins surged, spreading across his chest. His voice cracked, desperate. "Rick, don't listen. Don't do it. Don't you dare." Rick dropped to his knees in front of him, grabbing Morty's trembling hands. His voice was steady but thick with grief. "Morty, look at me. This thing doesn't get to decide how we end. Not me, not you. Us, together." He swallowed hard, his own resolve burning like fire through his chest. "But if one of us has to stay, it's you. It was always supposed to be you." Morty shook his head violently, tears spilling. "No! I don't want to survive without you. I'd rather—" His words broke into sobs. "I'd rather go too." Rick's throat constricted, but he forced himself to smile. The smallest, softest smile Morty had ever seen. "You're stronger than me, Morty. Stronger than you think. If there's a future, you'll carry it better than I ever could." The figure loomed closer, its form stretching wide. ready to consume. Rick stood tall, squaring his shoulders though every bone in him ached with fear. He whispered into Morty's hair, "I love you, kid, more than I ever said. Remember that." Morty clung to him, screaming through tears. "No! Don't leave me, Rick! Please!" Rick tore himself free with trembling hands and stepped toward the figure, every step heavier than the last. The void pulsed in anticipation, the silence reaching out like a tide. He could feel it pressing against his skin, seeping into him, demanding surrender. But as it closed in, something unexpected stirred. Morty stumbled forward, grasping Rick's coat. His voice cracked, but it carried a strength that shook the chamber. "No, if he gives himself, I give myself too. You can't take one without the other. We're together. Always." The silence faltered. For the first time it recoiled, as if struck. The veins across Morty's chest flickered, dimming. The figure wavered, its form rippling uncertainly. Rick turned stunned and saw the fire in Morty's eyes. Not fear, not despair. Defiance. "Morty," he whispered, his voice breaking. Morty held tighter. "You told me once you wouldn't let go. Well, I won't either. If this thing wants us, it has to take us both. But it can't. 'Cause we're not afraid anymore." The void convulsed, the chamber shaking as cracks of light tore through the darkness. The silence shrieked, not with words, but with raw frustration, as if its oldest weapon had failed. The cracks spread wider, flooding the chamber with warmth, with starlight, with the sound of every laugh and memory they had shared. Rick wrapped his arms around Morty, holding him as the world splintered around them. He whispered into his ear, soft and reverent, "You did it, Morty. You beat it. Not me. You." Morty buried his face into Rick's chest, sobbing with relief as the darkness crumbled away. The figure dissolved into nothing, consumed by the light pouring in. The silence was no longer endless. It was breaking, unraveling, fading into the distant hum of stars. When it was over, they found themselves standing in a vast, open sky. Clouds drifted like soft pillows, and above them constellations shimmered with gentle familiarity. The air was calm, the danger gone. Rick sank to the ground, pulling Morty into his lap, both too exhausted to speak for a long while. Finally, Morty whispered, "We made it, didn't we?" Rick nodded slowly, his voice barely above a breath. "Yeah, Morty, we did, and whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The stars seemed to bend closer, listening, as though the universe itself had been waiting for those words. Rick leaned back, Morty against his chest, both gazing upward in quiet awe. For the first time in what felt like eternity, there was no fear pressing down on them, only rest, only peace. "And somewhere," Rick murmured softly as his eyes drifted closed, "we're still out there, just napping in the sun. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man."